Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and another presentation focusing on the crises in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, but this time focusing on the Soviet Union's reaction to what unfolded, as well as a little bit on comparing the two crises. Now you'll see that there is still the opportunity for the examiners to set you a descriptive question. But there's of course also the chance to ask why the Soviet Union reacted the way it did, and why the crises ended the way they did. With regard to Hungary, Khrushchev at first seemed prepared to accept a degree of liberalisation, and Soviet troops actually began to withdraw from Hungary. But Hungary's proposal to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact was the step too far that drew a ruthless response. If Hungary was allowed to break free of Soviet control, the other satellite states would soon be making their own bids for freedom. The Soviet Union would lose its protective buffer and its extended economy. So, in November 1956, some 200,000 Soviet troops, supported by 2,500 tanks, moved on Budapest. The Hungarians fought for their rights and their independence, and it took 2 weeks of bitter fighting in which some 3,000 Hungarians died before the Soviet troops had quietened their protests. It's thought that Soviet casualties were numbered in their thousands too. The Hungarian appeals for help from the West went in vain. As a result, some 200,000 Hungarians fled across the border into Austria. Imre Nagy and his fellow leaders were first imprisoned and then executed. Nagy was replaced by a man Khrushchev could trust, János Kadar. In the aftermath, around 35,000 anti-communist activists were arrested, of whom 300 were executed. Only with the opposition crushed were some reforms then put in place. There had been a lot of optimism that Hungary would receive support from America and its new president, Dwight Eisenhower. He had been the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe in World War II, and his Secretary of State, his foreign minister, had assured Hungarians, saying, "You can count on us." However, though there were protests from America, the Hungarians were to be disappointed with the American response. America was preoccupied with a crisis almost entirely Western-made, the Suez Crisis, which gave the Soviet Union the chance to respond ruthlessly in Hungary, whilst the world's eyes were focused elsewhere. Moving to the Czech crisis, interestingly, though Brezhnev heralded a return to something like the Stalin years, in the first instance, the pressure to do something about the Prague Spring came not from Moscow, but from Poland and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Both the Polish leader, Władysław Gomulka, and the leader of the GDR, Walter Ulbricht, were concerned that if something wasn't done to curb what was happening in Czechoslovakia, then pressure for similar reforms would mount in their own countries. They were joined by the leaders of Hungary and Bulgaria. And of course, Moscow was only too willing to take up their concerns. Dubček's reforms did, after all, threaten Soviet control. The problem for the Soviet Union was always that once some reforms were given, more might be demanded, and other countries would surely demand the same. The Soviet Union was worried Czechoslovakia might ultimately leave the Warsaw Pact. And given Czechoslovakia's position at the centre of Europe, this just couldn't be allowed to happen. Pressure was put on Dubček to slow the pace of reform, and to focus Czech minds, Warsaw Pact troops from the Soviet Union, Poland and the GDR underwent training exercises on the Czech border. In July 1968, the Soviet Union leadership met with Dubček, and though he insisted on the path of reform, he accepted that allowing the formation of a social democratic party would be a step too far. The meeting seemed to remove the tension. So, when more than 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops, supported by tanks, moved into Czechoslovakia on August the 20th, the sense of shock was considerable. But the Soviet Union claimed they were acting in response to a plea for help from the party and the government leaders in Czechoslovakia. Unlike what happened in Hungary, the Czech government appealed to its people not to resist, and though there was in fact some resistance, the death toll was mercifully less than 100, unlike the Hungarian crisis, which was measured in thousands. Instead, the Czech government called for passive resistance, non-cooperation, and there were also peaceful protests. People climbed onto the tanks, waving Czech flags, or else put flowers on them. And many Czechs chose not to cooperate with the Soviet troops. Bravely, and very sadly, one student, Jan Palach, set fire to himself in protest in Wenceslas Square in Prague. Dubček was ordered to Moscow to explain himself. On his return, he was forced to tell the Czech people himself that their newfound freedoms were at an end. He was eventually removed from power, but did not pay with his life. He was made ambassador to Turkey, but was later expelled from the Communist Party, and in a clear act to humiliate him, was made a humble clerk. As for the Czech people, well, the optimism of the Prague Spring gave way to utter despair, and a country that had intended to remain within the Soviet bloc now deeply resented the Soviet Union. It's estimated that 150,000 Czechs fled their country. The whole thing gave rise to what came to be known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Different paths to socialism may be acceptable, but not alternatives to socialism. And in particular, the one-party system had to be maintained, as did membership of the Warsaw Pact. The underlying message, though, was that forces hostile to socialism are a problem for the whole Soviet bloc, and independent actions by countries within the bloc could only be limited in nature. As had been the case in Hungary, the West expressed horror and sympathy for the Czech people, but it was not prepared to risk war. It still accepted that Eastern Europe fell within the Soviet sphere of influence. The Iron Curtain again held firm. Still, the Soviet Union was criticized for invading another communist country by China. So to some comparisons and more potential questions. Looking on the left side of this slide, you can see that essentially the same question can be asked from polar opposite perspectives, but they are the same question, or at least should elicit very similar responses. And as well as the events leading to the crises, Answers to these questions could include a comparison of the Soviet Union's reaction, whilst the last question on the left-hand side clearly focuses on a comparison of their response. Some broad common factors to think about: how the Soviet Union reacted, how other states then reacted, and the consequences. And to the right, the questions take us back to the causes of the crisis. That in 1968, Czechoslovakia also tried to free itself from Soviet dominance and take a different road to socialism obviously puts it in the same category as Hungary 12 years earlier. However, there were a number of differences, and to help you tease out the comparisons and differences, I suggest you think first of the context of each crisis and the people's demands, and then think about what happened. But don't forget my presentations on 6 common factors and what was unique about each crisis. Again, despite cutting the content down an awful lot, I feel I've packed a lot into this presentation. As always, I hope it proves useful for you, and I do thank you for listening. And in case you're wondering, and let's be honest, I would be, on the left of this slide is a memorial to those who died in the Hungarian uprising. And on the right is a memorial to Jan Palach. Cheers.